The old port had changed its name several times until 1431, when it silted up altogether. From that time onwards, Cochin replaced it as the region's main harbour. These days, the urbanised site is known as Kotun Kular. I hope I've read that right. Kotun Kolur, possibly. Although Roman speculators usually bankrolled the ancient maritime trade, Greek seamen almost invariably navigated the ships. Those Greek mariners, often natives of Alexandria, invariably worshipped the Egyptian goddess Isis. The cult of Isis had by then become a world religion, with very many devotees all around the Mediterranean and beyond. Isis was particularly important as the protector of people on dangerous sea voyages. Isis was said to have many names, and one of them, as I shall prove in this book, is the Tamil goddess Patini, the guardian deity of Sri Lanka, who was once also worshipped by the Hindus and Buddhists of South India. Back then, Patini was a composite Jaina Buddhist deity. A central feature of her mythology concerns the killing and death of her husband Palanga, her search for him, her role as Mater Dolorosa, weeping over his corpse, and her power to resurrect him, albeit temporarily. This resurrection motif is hardly found anywhere else in the Hindu tradition, with the possible exception of the myth of Savitri, as found in the Mahabharata. Here's the story from the Mahabharata, a text whose historical frame is difficult to place, but which some say could record some of the dynastic struggles of South India. The old king of Madras, being childless, received as a boon from the goddess Savitri a daughter beautiful enough to be her incarnation. At puberty she was beautiful, and he sent her out to look for a husband among forest-dwelling communities. There she found a young man called Satyavan, quote, great soul, unquote. Or occasionally he is called Chitsava, quote, draw of horses, unquote, because of his skill in sketching horses. He is of noble birth, the child of a former deposed king who had retired to the forest to pursue a religious life in a hermitage. The whole scenario sounds very like a typical Buddhist or Jaina milieu. The only fault of this perfect youth was that he was destined to live but one more year. The match was agreed, and Savitri moved to the forest retreat to live an aesthetic life with her new husband and family. She dresses in clothes made of birch bark dyed red. On the fateful day of his life, fateful last day of his life, she goes with her husband foraging in the forest. He becomes weak and sleeps. As she guards him, a fearsome god, also dressed in red, appears holding a noose. This is Yama, god of the dead, lord of Pitris, or spirits, who, rather than sending his emissaries, has come in person to claim the soul of Satyavan. This he has done because this is a great soul. Yama then pulls the life, or the jiva, from his body, which becomes lifeless and unsightly. The jiva is the size of his thumb. He takes it to the south, but Savitri follows Yama, keeping precisely 7 paces behind him, which causes Yama to ask her why she is following. Thus he learns of devotion, and as a reward he grants her a miracle. Offering to cure the blindness of her father-in-law, Yama is able to offer this as he is a creature of fire, the very element which is thought to be connected with sight. Obviously, not satisfied, Savitri continues to follow, several times engaging the Lord of Death in discussion, and each time impressing him sufficiently by her merits for him to grant her a succession of boons. Thus she earns 5 miracles, culminating in the restoration of her husband. Returning to the story of Patini, at Kotunkola, near Cochin, there is an ancient temple which has the remains of a secret underground shrine which, so I intend to argue, was originally dedicated to her ancient cult. This temple has seen many changes since it was first founded at the time of Christ. In the Indian Middle Ages, circa 9th century in the modern calendar, Hinduism became the largest religion of the region and Buddhism and Jainism disappeared. Hinduism itself experienced a series of reforms, initiated coincidentally by a former Buddhist called Shankara, who was born in Kotunkola. The original rites were discontinued or driven underground. A purely Hindu goddess called Kali replaced Patini. Even so, some of the original descendants of the Isis worshippers managed to hang on through the changes and are still to this day preserve connection to the temple, although not as priests, pujaris, but as administrators. The opening of the ways. This remarkable survival of Egyptian ideas transferred to this South India temple was only possible due to an equally remarkable feat of navigation. The beginnings of contact between India and the Middle East is lost in the mists of ancient history or even prehistory. We need only to look to the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato for evidence of ancient connections. In his book, there is a description of a medical system that has been identified as an early account of Indian Ayurveda. Quote, "A third class of diseases we must conceive as arising in 3 ways. One by the agency of air, the second by phlegm, the third of bile." Unquote. The 3 humours or doshas of Ayurveda are Vata, Pitta and Kapha, often translated as air, phlegm and bile. In 336 BCE, a few years after Plato's death, Alexander, a Macedonian largely unknown outside of his native land, ascended the throne of his murdered father Philip. Macedonia was a province of northern Greece, but it soon became the hub of an international empire stretching from Egypt to the banks of the river Indus. Alexander's conquest of the northwestern reaches of the Indian subcontinent, modern-day Pakistan, in the 4th century before Christ established a land bridge. Take a look at a modern map and think of the geopolitics of this route. The road into the northwest of India via Afghanistan is dangerous today, and it was hardly less so in ancient times. For those who travelled the land bridge between east and west, it was long, hard, expensive, and dangerous. Alexander's famous retreat from India later established a coastal route. Ships soon retraced his journey, which for safety reasons they sailed strictly within sight of land. Consequently, all cargoes were taxed as they entered the coastal waters of many small kingdoms that ringed the coast. Mediterranean merchant ships could, in this manner, reach the rich marts of the extreme south of India. But it was a very long voyage, often of more than 2 years' duration. Sometimes these ships never returned. This is hardly an attractive investment for a Roman entrepreneur. Even so, the Romans wanted to buy diamonds, pearls, sapphires, agate, onyx, rubies, ivory, and muslins. They also wanted Chinese silks, Indian cottons, peacocks, large tigers for the amphitheatre, carnelian, cardamom, and above all, pepper. The Romans were particularly fond of pepper. Indeed, so much did a taste for this precious commodity spread to the rest of their empire that even Alaric the Goth demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper in his treaty with the Romans of AD 408. Pepper was more than a culinary herb. Its excellent medicinal qualities had been described in Ayurvedic Indian medicine for millennia. The kingdoms in South India were particularly rich in these commodities, and the Romans, with their Greek vessels, regularly plied their trade here along what is termed the Malabar coast. This journey may be long, but the rewards were sufficiently great to make it just viable to follow the long route, coasting around the rim of the Arabian Indian Ocean. Port taxes, nowadays called cabotage, were steep and probably too frequent. But the bottom line was that at journey's end the ship's cargo would provide more than enough profit to make the whole enterprise worthwhile. Before the 21st year of the Common Era, the historian Pliny estimated that 120 ships had made the trip. Although the south of India was never part of the Roman Empire, the Romans established several trading stations on its western and eastern coasts, Malabar and Coromandel. With the benefit of modern maps, we can see that there is a direct route across the Arabian Ocean to the prosperous trading centres of the south, but the journey is one of more than 200 miles of open ocean. During the rulership of Roman Emperor Augustus, 23 BCE to CE 14, there are records of visits to Rome of at least 2 Indian delegations. Soon after this visit, or perhaps later, during the reign of Claudius, Greek navigators confirmed the existence of the direct route to South India. Only during the reign of Augustus was maritime technology sufficiently well organised to make the open ocean route a viable one. It took advantage of a monsoon wind that came later to be known as Hippalos, a Greek personal name, and therefore assumed to be that of an early nautical pioneer. Using this wind, a trading ship could, in 40 days, sail directly across the ocean from Ocelis in modern Aden to the ancient port of Muciris, near to what is today called the city of Cochin in modern Kerala. 2 monsoon systems, a southwestern and northeastern, dominate the Arabian Sea. The southwest monsoon would bring ships from the Red Sea to India's western or Malabar coast. Stormy, wet winds started in May and were calm enough from August to November to be conducive for sailing. The northeastern winds begin in October and from January to May provide good sailing from India, faring eastwards to the Red Sea. Armed with this knowledge, merchant ships, having sold their cargo of copper, lead, tin, wine, slaves, silver and gold coins, could sail back, making landfall at Ocelis, or Aden, on the Arabian coast. From there it was a relatively straightforward trip to the Red Sea port of Berenice, where the cargo could be taken across the desert to be reloaded onto Nile ships for transport to Alexandria and thence onward to Rome. A skilled navigator with knowledge of this pattern of ocean winds could make the hardest part of the journey in 40 days. When the pioneers had done their work, the route became as predictable and therefore as safe as crossing the Mediterranean itself. The great scholar, Professor Camille Zvelbil, has written a lively account of the impact of one of these early speculative voyages. As this trade wind still bears the ancient Greek name Hippalos, Professor Zvelbil, exercising some poetic license, gave the name Hippalos to the novel's central character, the vessel's Alexandrian captain. The Tamil language has many words borrowed from Europe, and in turn there are many words in Greek, Latin and even Semitic tongues derived from Asian technical terms. In linguistics, these are known generally as loan words. So, for example, the Indian term Yavana or Yonaka in the following passage is Greek Ionian. Muziris, the great Cheramat, is the main seaport of the ancient kingdom of the Cheras. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. On the western coast of southern India, always lively, always crowded, never dull, never quiet, was on that particular day in the grip of feverish excitement. Along the banks of the river Periyar lingered groups of tired harbour serfs, filling their bellies with turtle fat, enjoying the roasted flesh of lampreys and flushing that heavy treat down with strong hot palm wine. They were probably the only ones who failed to be thrilled by what was happening that late afternoon out on the sea. On the mole, on the pier, and along the shore, throngs and crowds of dark-skinned men and women, and children were watching the monstrous apparition of a huge ship which was emerging from behind the horizon, in a straight line ahead towards the west, where the endless ocean spread out from India into unknown, unseen regions. Bullock carts along the paved roads stopped. Palanquins and sedan chairs were lowered onto the sand, still warm, and even the light, swift chariots stood immobile, their passengers watching the approaching sea monster. An elephant, halted in its progress, knelt down, expecting its mahout to descend, but the man preferred to remain sitting in the howdah, since from the elevated post of observation he had a better view of what was happening. A pirate. Nonsense. Pirate boats are smaller and faster. I say, a pirate from Nitra. What a monster. Huge, isn't she? Must be a Yavana vessel. A Yavana vessel? Rubbish. They always come coasting from the north. I told you it's a pirate from the islands. No, it's not a pirate. It's a Makana fish, a leviathan, a whale. Laughter all around at the attempted joke. Then, look, I can see the mastheads now. 1, 2, 3. It's a ship of the Romanicas, it must be. Now they could see it was a Yavanna ship, incredibly large, with 3 masts, and what was utterly unexpected, it approached the port of Musiri straight from across the seas, not as usual from the northern quarter, along the narrow coastline of the Chera Kingdom, which even then was called Keralam. Alexandra to Coptos, from Coptos to Berenice, from Berenice to Ocelis, and then on July 15th from Ocelis at the southern tip of the Arabia Strait across the Mare Erythraeum. The above is a fictionalized account of the arrival in India of Roman and Greek traders. It is a big story in itself, but what I intend to concentrate on is the religious belief of the newcomers, in particular the goddess Isis, whom they certainly venerated and transported to India. The goddess Isis. The Egyptian goddess Isis had already travelled a long way from her antique origins before she even set foot on those Roman ships. Isis is remarkable in several ways. To many historians and modern devotees, she is the great goddess, who has been with us since the beginning of time. But the story of Isis did not always look so grand. Her origins may in fact be more humble, but no less venerable and magical for that. She may once have been a spiritual entity connected with the home, where she was an ancestral spirit who was invoked during the period of mourning for the dead. In the pharaonic high culture which came after these early archaic mindsets, she was given a new form and a new name. The texts that record this process arguably hint at her original name, which may well have been Heat or Hayat. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. The hat bird comes the Djert or Jert bird. This is Isis with Nephthys. They come seeking their brother Osiris. The descriptions of the deeds of Isis in the so-called pyramid texts furnish the earliest known archaeological evidence for her worship. These are still Egypt's oldest known religious literature. These texts are inscribed on the walls of the first pyramids and are therefore usually dated to about 24,000 to 23,000 BCE. It is likely that the religious myths contained in these texts were developed by the priesthood sometime before they were carved in stone. The pyramid texts are a window not just on Isis but on a wider cult that included her famous husband Osiris. The texts themselves seem to refer back to an older solar cult that was known to the scribes from an older pre-existent manuscript tradition. We cannot really understand the goddess Isis unless we look in detail at her husband Osiris. This is because for the first few thousand years of its existence, Osiris was the most important thing in her life, her cult. It is only in later times, and by that I mean those of the Roman and Greek, that the goddess Isis became more important than her husband. The cult of Osiris. The pyramid texts contain many passages referring to the cult of Osiris, but a complete or canonical version of the myth is more easily read in texts that are actually written 1500 years later. This is the time of the 18th dynasty, circa 1500 BCE. The 18th dynasty contains many of the most famous to us of all Egyptians, including among them are the female pharaoh Hatshepsut and the heretic king Akhenaten. The great hymn of Osiris, or hymn of Amenmose, is our primary source. Amenmose was not a king but a minor court official. His funeral stela is of fine construction. In the lunette above the extensive text, he is shown together with his family. Here is an extract. Praise to thee, Osiris, thou Lord of eternity, King of gods. Thou with many names and lordly of being, with mysterious ceremonies in the temples. Noteworthy here is possible references to the existence of a mystery cult functioning in the gods' temples. The existence of mystery cults in ancient Egypt is controversial and denied by some authorities. The eminent Eric Hornung seems put out that his colleague Jan Assmann, quote, who is otherwise not inclined towards esoteric interpretations, sees secret Hermetic wisdom as a sort of Kabbalah in the books of the netherworld from the royal tombs, unquote. Returning to our text, one reads, the firmament and its stars hearken unto him, and the great portals open to him. To whom men shout for joy in the southern sky, whom men adore in the northern sky. This passage above is an allusion to death and resurrection of the god Osiris. We know this from reading similar passages in so-called books of afterlife, such as the Book of Gates, where the progress of Osiris through the underworld to resurrection at dawn is clearly mapped out against the night sky. The imperishable stars are under his authority, and the never-wearying ones are his place of abode. The imperishable stars are the northern circumpolar constellations in which Egyptian gods were thought to dwell, although, rather confusingly, Osiris has a strong association with the southern constellation Orion. Offerings are made to him by the command of Geb, and the 9 gods adore him. They that are in the underworld kiss the ground, and they that are in the necropolis make an obeisance. The deceased shout for joy when they behold him, that they are in fear of him. The 2 lands together give him praise at the approach of his majesty. He that established right through the 2 river banks, and placed the sun upon his father's seat, praised of his father Geb, beloved of his mother Nuit. This allusion here is to the important Heliopolitan cosmology, one of the several ways of looking at the origin of the gods and humanity. In this version, the earth god Geb and the sky mother Nuit are the parents of 4 gods, two couples, viz. Isis and Osiris, Seth and Nephthys. The heir of Geb in the kingship of the two lands. He saw how excellent he was, and he entrusted it to him to lead the two lands to good fortune. Because Isis and Osiris were born before Seth and Nephthys, they have the legal status conferred by primogeniture, and ought by natural right to inherit the kingdom of their father Geb. He placed this land in his hand, its water and its air, its crops and its cattle, all that filleth and all that flattereth, its worms and its wild beasts were made over to the sons of Nuit, and the two lands were contented therewith. His sister protected him. But things do not go smoothly, and their status is contested. The issue was new, because all previous generations of gods had been one male with one female. There is nothing self-evidently valid in the plea to primogeniture. Indeed, it all coincides with the rise or emergence of the institution of kingship. Perhaps in earlier ages things were different, and other ways of managing inheritance of wealth and titles were the norm. The second-born son, Seth, is jealous of his older brother, and eventually makes a murderous assault in a manner familiar to us from the later myths, such as that of Cain and Abel. This is too taboo for the ancient poet to dwell upon in detail. He merely tells us that the goddess Isis tries to protect her husband/brother Osiris, although she is really only able to protect his corpse and his legacy. She that held the foes aloof and warded off the deeds of the miscreant by the beneficent things of her mouth, she of the excellent tongue, whose words come not to naught, and admirable to command. The god Seth is here called the miscreant. The reference to beneficent words of her mouth is taken to mean the goddess's well-known use of magic and the related power of words. Beneficent Isis, that protected her brother, that sought for him without wearying, that traversed this land mourning, and took no rest until she found him. Isis searches and eventually finds the corpse of Osiris, which Seth has dismembered and left floating in the Nile until the current sweeps it down to the delta. She that affords him shade with her feathers, and with her wings created air, she that cried aloud for joy and brought her brother to land. Here the hymn describes Isis in her most popular form, personified as a kite, the bird of morning. As a bird, she searches for the corpse from the air, then protects it, fanning air into Osiris with her wings. She that revived the faintness of the weary one, that took in his seed and provided an heir, that suckled the child in solitude, the place where he was being unknown, that brought him, when his arm was strong, into the hall of Geb. Although Osiris is dead, Isis manages through her uncanny powers to revive him. This is the unique aspect of their myth that is the model for many later stories of dying and resurrecting gods, including a special example from India. Osiris is revived just long enough to conceive an heir, the god Horus. Some also see this as a miraculous or even virgin birth. She is virgin because up until this point Isis has no other children, and conception is not by the normal way. We shall return to this theme later, when it is amplified in later mystery cults. Horus is a falcon god, therefore shares the avian form of his mother rather than the anthropoid form of his father. This provides further reason why Seth can dispute the inheritance of Horus. It is also the reason Horus needs to be hidden from his uncle Seth until he is old enough to return to the court of his grandfather Geb and claim his birthright. Only when he is fully grown and powerful adult has he any hope of avenging the murder of his father Osiris. The Ennead cried out full of joy, "Welcome, Horus, son of Osiris, stalwart, hearted, justified, son of Isis, heir of Osiris." The ancient narrative gets a little ahead of itself, anticipating the outcome of a tribunal of all the gods that must decide if Horus does have a valid claim to the throne of his father. His paternity is never in doubt, which strikes us as odd given what has happened. Could the ancestry of his mother Isis play a role in the tribunal's decision? Perhaps the survival of ancient matrilineal law codes. The Tribunal of Truth assembled for him, the Ennead and the Lord of all himself, the Lords of Truth that were united therein, that turned their backs on iniquity. The Tribunal of all the gods sat down in the hall of Geb with the intent to assign the office to its lord, the kingdom to whom it should be given. It was found that the word of Horus was true, and the office of his father was given unto him. He came forth crowned by the command of Geb, but received the lordship of the 2 river banks, and the crown rested securely on his head. The assumption of kingship by Horus rests solely on the word of his mother Isis, that she gave birth to him, and that his father was Osiris. In ancient laws of succession, the lineage did in fact pass to the son of the first wife of the reigning king, rather than to the second in line to the throne. Horus, while still a child, must prove he is able to rule. As I mentioned earlier, other than the presentation of these myths in the pyramid texts, there is surprisingly little archaeological evidence for the existence of a cult of Osiris, or for his consort Isis, for the era before the pyramids were built. There are no temples or shrines, no statues or dedications. If Isis had any prehistoric cult centres in Egypt, their whereabouts are, as yet, unknown. Her main cult places in later times were Behbet el Hagar in the Delta, which was not even founded until 380 BCE. Older centres are evidenced at Akhmin, at Coptos, and most famous of all at Philae. All of these are a comparatively late date in the very long and sustained tradition of Egyptian temple building. The absence from the archaeological record needs to be explained. It seems possible that Isis and Osiris were not part of the oldest strata of belief, or if they were parts of other constellations of gods. The scribes have obviously been up to a bit of myth-making, rearranging all the characters of older times and composing a totally new drama. we can still see some of the joins in this ancient cut and paste exercise. Horus, the falcon god, was, indeed he is, one of the oldest of all Egyptian gods, as is the miscreant god Set or Seth, who was originally paired with Horus not as wicked uncle but as his brother. The cow goddess Hathor, the obliging grandmother Neith, all have ancient antecedents. Instead, all of the actors in the myth of Isis and Osiris possess ample archaeological evidence of an ancient life. Apart, that is, from the principal golden couple. This and other obvious inconsistencies throw doubt on the extreme antiquity of the myth, although for most of us it is old as it needs to be. The situation is complex because Isis then takes over many of the attributes of the older goddesses such as Hathor. It therefore seems highly likely that the rise of the cult of Isis and Osiris can be traced to a particular event, much as we might ascribe a date to the birth of the Christian or Muslim faith. One such obvious political event was the unification of the whole land of Egypt under one ruler. The myth of the divine kingship enters the discourse at the very same moment, along with several other innovations, including the abandonment of the archaic lunar ritual calendar, replaced by the 360 plus 5 days solar year that is so linked with the Osirian cult. Archaeologists are steadily assembling a great deal of information about Egypt's ancient origins. The people who eventually became the Egyptians once lived in what is now the arid Sahara Desert. For a brief time in the late Neolithic, part of the desert were green and fertile land, and a prehistoric culture developed beside a great lake. But ecological changes caused this lake to desiccate, forcing the people to move. They came to the banks of the Nile. Their familiarity with the ecology of periodic floods helped them to manage the Nile's annual inundation. They saw how the flood resolved itself into a series of 42 temporary lakes. Coincidentally or not, but 42 is an important symbolic number. It is, for example, the number of judges in the underworld. Each of these 42 lakes supported a different tribe and was a consequence represented by a special fetish or totem. When the climactic conditions in the Nile Valley worsened, some individuals must have proved themselves more skilled at managing the food supply, ensuring there were resources in good times and bad. This is rather like the myth of Joseph and the famines of Egypt as remembered in the Bible. It is posited that these natural cycles provided opportunities for some family clans to accumulate wealth and resources. This situation provided an opportunity for someone to show leadership, and in it perhaps lies the origin of the chieftain, who later became a local king, and eventually a single king unifying all under his, or sometime her, rule. It is only after all these changes that the mature myth of Isis and Osiris comes into the world. This leads some to ask whether the story of Isis and Osiris is, quote, true myth, unquote. A true myth would be one that has mystical, numinous origins, rather than being some kind of scribal or political construction. John Gwynne Griffiths is the great scholarly expert on this material and has translated many of the classic sources, principally Plutarch's Isis and Osiris. Here he writes, quote, "The myth appears thus to dissolve itself into a story built around a set of ceremonies in which the dead king is the centre. This does not mean that it is not a true myth of a particular kind. It must be categorized as one of those which are engendered by ritual, although it draws upon the mythology already attached to the protagonists, in the case the living king, who is Horus." Unquote. Isis and her sister Nephthys are often called the two kites. Kites are raptors who eat carrion, usually small mammals. The Egyptologist Siegfried Schott has suggested that these birds were symbols of mourning long before they were identified with goddesses such as Isis and Nephthys. So Isis must originally have been a representation of the mourner at an archaic funeral, mimicking the gathering of birds, especially the vultures that sometimes circle and wait to devour a fresh corpse. This marks the beginning of a long association between birds and the ominous, a commonplace of folklore the world over. Kites are not known as devourers of the whole corpses of large animals, although human dead are routinely eaten by vultures. It is possible that the kite, because of its distinctive screeching, became associated with the keening of mourners, or indeed the keening of mourners may be borrowed from the behaviour of the birds. These are very ancient beliefs. One can perhaps see how the bare facts of the disposal of the dead in the Stone Ages might have over time evolved into ritual exposure of the body to be eaten by scavengers, such as the jackal or vulture. This returning of the flesh to the biosphere naturally leads to the idea of the vulture as mother of new life. In her book, Isis Magic, Culminating the Goddess with 1,000 Names, Isadora Forrest makes a connection between Isis and the supposed bird of prey goddess of Catalhoyuk. In this, she is following the contested theories of anthropologist Marija Gimbutas, especially the language of the goddess. This remarkable ancient settlement in Turkey was occupied between 750,000 BCE to 57,000 BCE. Let me read that again. This remarkable ancient settlement in Turkey was occupied between 75,000 BCE to 57,000 BCE. It was partially excavated in the 1960s and restarted in the 1990s, directed by Ian Hodder. The work of Gimbutas was based on the earlier discoveries. Many of the theories about a supposed ancient goddess culture at the site have been considerably amended by the newer discoveries. At Catalhoyuk, there are indeed depictions of vultures devouring headless corpses. But is there any obvious sign that these vultures are female? Whether they are female or goddesses is really a little uncertain. These scenes come from inside domestic houses, under whose floors the inhabitants also buried their dead. It is not unlikely that these images have something to do with transcendence, transformation of something from one state into another. Isis assumes this bird form when performing one of her most important roles. In the words of Amen Mose, she, that afforded him shade with her feathers, and with her wings created air, she that cried aloud for joy, and brought her brother to land, she that revived the faintness of the weary one, that took in his seed and provided an heir. She does not take this form in any other context. This, then, is her most primal role, a launch pad from which she accumulates a number of other functions within Egyptian religion. This particular function of guarding the dead Osiris, and only in this function. He continues, quote, "Other goddesses are mentioned as fulfilling a similar function, but the emergence of Isis and Nephthys as the constant actors of the role is perhaps part of the triumph of the Osirian cult." Quote, Gwen Griffiths thought this identification was really a reflection of the power of the falcon god Horus, the divine counterpart of the living king. The rise of Isis occurs at the same time as the emergence of this idea of divine kingship. It is as well to remind ourselves that the institution of kingship is an innovation of historic times. The iconography of Isis shows her with a hieroglyph above or on her head. This hieroglyph is a stylized throne. The name Isis could literally be interpreted as meaning the throne, which some see as evidence of royal descent being somehow dependent on the female line. The connection of Isis to the cult of divine kingship is exemplified by another of her avatars, the Uraeus, or spitting cobra, who sits upon the royal diadem as the ultimate protector of the king. There is a quote from Into the Mysteries Door of the West. Book of Gates, the 12th hour. Through twin doors of the horizon, it is the dawn, when holy serpents fly and two cobras lie, Isis and her sister Nephthys, those who light for Ra, going after this god into mysterious door of the west. In the Roman era, this serpent form is further extended to absorb an ancient deity connected with the harvest, Renenutet, then known as Thermutis and paired with Serapis, a later form of Osiris. Another major change in her role takes place in the New Kingdom when she assimilates the symbolism of the ancient cow goddess Hathor. According to Francesco Tiradriti, quote, "This represents the beginning of her liberation from the cult of Osiris and emergence as a deity in her own right," unquote. The goddess Hathor has a long prehistoric pedigree. She is similar, if not the same goddess as the disembodied Bat, meaning female soul, shown on one of Egypt's oldest and most important artifacts, the ceremonial Nama palette of the 31st century BCE. Decapitation, or being disembodied, is an extremely ancient funeral practice. We are so used to seeing portrait busts that we have forgotten to remember that this is no mere artistic convention. The absence of the body in divine images, such as those of Bat, Hathor, Bez, etc., is quite deliberate and recalls a cult focused on the head. Bat's origins also lead us back to a prehistoric cattle cult. In a mythological episode, Isis literally takes or is given the head of a cow to replace one her son Horus has lopped off in a rage. From this point on, Isis retains her anthropoid form, but with a crown of cow's horns and a solar disc. Hathor is variously the patroness of music, alcohol, and sexuality. Hathor and Isis represent two important female types. Hathor is said to instantiate the more antisocial side of female sexuality. Hathor is more about the non-procreative sex, whereas Isis is the archetype of the ideal Egyptian woman. Her eroticism is sometimes more conventional than that of Hathor. She is loyal and faithful to her divine husband, Osiris, even beyond death. Isis also takes Hathor's most famous magical accessory, a rattle called a sistrum. She also assumes the ritual container known as a situla, a breast-shaped pot or bucket used to make libations of cow's milk. This association is particularly interesting for the Indian cult of Patini, to be discussed below. Isis also absorbs the fecund aspect of Hathor, even exploiting her relationship with the sun god Ra, and at the same time giving it this interesting twist.